Hello, I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about flow or hyperfocus, which appear to be the same thing. I'll be talking for about 20 minutes. If you have questions while I'm talking, you can type them in and I will get to them at the end. And as usual, I'll be starting with the take-home message. The take-home message is that the state that positive psychology studies as flow does seem to be the exact same brain state as hyperfocus in ADHD. The linkage of the two together implies that everyone, not just people with ADHD, can have this phenomena. And despite decades of focus on the flow end of things, there's a few different theories going on, but we don't really know what the brain is doing in this state or how to replicate it consistently. That's the simple take-home message. So why I'm talking about it today is that the Hungarian researcher who spent most of his research life in working in Italy, Mihail Csikszentmihalyi, and if I'm butchering his name, I can't spell it any better than I can pronounce it, coined the word flow in 1975. He died earlier this year in 2021, so this is sort of in honor of his extensive research and work and achievements in this area. So what is this flow state or hyperfocus state? Again, most of us have been in it at some time or another. Some of us have spent much more time in this state, but it's a state of being energized, focused, of being extremely present and in the moment. But often, even though if you're present in the moment, there's a loss of sense of self. The sense of self is imbued with doing rather than sort of being and watching. So complete absorption in the task, losing a sense of time, so that time often feels like you're standing still, or you're amazed when you get out of the state how much time has passed. There's an intensity to the state, but there's a relaxation or feeling that someone's in the flow or in the mode or everything's clicking or working. And Csikszentmihalyi started studying this because he was interested in artists, where he saw artists, painters, composers, others who were so engrossed in their work, so absorbed in their work, that they would literally go days without eating, that their sleep would be disrupted. They were ignoring normal bodily functions, normal cues in the world around them. They were so absorbed in this intense state. And clearly this is a state that many artists can engage in, but also, and probably the biggest area of research right now, is for athletes. That may have more to do with our society's values than something else, but we talk about pitchers getting in the flow, the game of the World Series, or basketball players being in the zone and making 5 3-pointers in an 18-minute span of time, or divers or other, again, athletes needing to be in the flow, being completely present and in the moment and to achieve their peak performance. Other areas that's been looked at and researched are in video gamers, but also in the workforce. There's big incentive to have workers performing at their peak, to be in the moment, to not be distracted, to be intensely engaged and productive and hopefully creative when they're doing it. So there's a fair amount of work there. Again, from the flow perspective, from the ADHD perspective, it's more often framed as a detriment by the researchers. I mean, certainly in the ADD patient world, there are blogs about how hyperfocus is my superpower. So again, just as with these high-achieving athletes, artists, and others, people with ADHD can get deeply engaged in a project they're working on, whether it's for work or a hobby or other interests they have, and so engrossed in it that they become oblivious to the outside world. Again, in the ADHD world, it's often framed as a problem because the person engaged in the state is oblivious to the outside world. So their cohorts may be going to lunch and they're blowing them off and don't seem connected to the team or working with the team, or little Johnny's so engaged in coloring in his coloring book that he doesn't realize that the class has moved on to a different project in grade school. So part of the detrimental effect is that it can be so absorbing that someone is oblivious to the world around them, and particularly with ADHD, another aspect of the problematic nature is that the person can be so absorbed in a task that may not be particularly in alignment with their work goals or career goals. So they're, I'll get to the 6 characteristics that Csikszentmihalyi characterized as part of the flow state. So again, with ADHD, the problem can be sometimes that it's hyperfocus, quote, on the wrong thing. We can have a debate as to whether the individual or whether society or whether the family or who should be deciding what the right thing is, but I'll put that aside for the moment. So the 6 traits of or characteristics of the flow state that Csikszentmihalyi described are: 1, being completely present in the moment, focused and concentrated on that, so you're not distracted by anything else. 2 is sort of a merger between action and awareness, so you are usually it's an activity you're engaged in, often physically, like artists or athletes, but coding or other things that are requiring you to engage rather than just observing or looking at it. So the situation. 3, there's a loss of the reflective self and the loss of reflective consciousness. So again, you are doing, you are engaged, you are in it, but you're not thinking about what are those people thinking of how I'm looking. So there's no social anxiety component to that, no often even awareness of the self except in the next point. So point number 4 is that the flow state does involve a sense of personal control. So again, this differentiates it from maybe a state induced by hallucinogens or by religious fervor or by great beauty. Standing on the brink of the Grand Canyon, you may have a loss of reflective self-consciousness. You may be acutely present, but again, in the flow state, you have a sense of personal control, that you're there, you're doing something. So the other 2 points, so point number 5, characteristic of a flow state, is that there's distortion of time. And again, time often seems like it's standing still while the person's doing it, or barely passing, or so actively engrossed, absorbed, identified in the moment, and then again, usually when the task comes to an end, they realize that they've been doing it for 3 hours or 6 hours or a day or essentially most of a week on an art project involved in this. So the distortion of time sense is intrinsic. And then, the 6th factor is that a characteristic of this, that the task itself is one that's intrinsically rewarding. So the person has some connection to self with the goal, that it isn't imposed on them. It's not something they're being forced to do. They have true enjoyment. So there's a positive, not just a working hard, but that this is truly enjoyable, rewarding. So separate from the 6 characteristics of the state, Csikszentmihalyi and his co-workers also identified sort of 3 preconditions for entering this state. So one is, they say, tasks that have clear goals and clear markers of progress are much more likely to engage that flow state. So if you have an amorphous, build a better society, eliminate racial justice, you're not going to cure global warming. They may have clear goals. Some of those may be broader or fuzzier goals, but it's hard to demarcate progress along the way. Whereas if it's play the best basketball you can for this game of the series, that's a more defined goal. And if you're getting baskets, you know that you're making progress in it. If you have an idea as a painter for what you're trying to do and you have a canvas that's a certain shape and size, and you know whether or not you're putting paint or ink or charcoal or crayon or whatever on it. You can see your goal, you can see progress being made towards it. So that was one of the three conditions. The other two are that you need clear and immediate feedback. So clearly in an athletic endeavor, you're usually either from your competitors or the points being scored, whatever, you're getting feedback that yes, what you're doing is working. If you're playing a video game, you're scoring points, you're engaging that way, you have feedback. And again, in the absence of that, some feedback, some interaction between the environment and you to tell you that you're succeeding, that it's hard to be in a flow state. And then the third one is that flow is most likely to occur in situations in which there is a close match between your perceptions of what the challenge is and of your own skill set, and that both of those are fairly high or rigorous. So that something that's, score 14 more points in this quarter of the basketball game is a specific challenge, and if you think that that is potentially within your abilities, then that's a good match for creating flow. If you can't even shoot a basket, that getting 14 points is still a challenge, but it's not well matched to your skill set. Similarly, there may be a close match, but if it's pick 2 dandelions in this field of flowers, that challenge is so simple that you're likely to get bored, apathetic doing it. So again, the flow state seems to require or be most easily induced when there's a close match between your perception of your abilities and the demands of the task, and that both of those are fairly high. So there are 3 basic theories, and they are not mutually exclusive as to what's going on in the flow state. So the one that's probably gotten the most attention, and particularly it's been used by lots of coaches in the sporting realm, trying to help get athletes into the zone, into the flow state. And that's that the flow state's mostly about information processing, and it's a hypofrontal state, so that if you have well-practiced skills and you know what you're doing, then it's useful for the brain to focus on, or to use your information to process executing those skills, and to not divert time, labor, effort into thinking about who you are, what's going on in the rest of the world, the distractions. So the hypofrontal theory is based on the process that your brain has a limited capacity to process information. And if you are so intensely, vigorously engaging your motor skills and your visual spatial skills to achieve a certain task, then the brain just doesn't have the energy or resources to put into thinking about your place in the universe and what else is going around you and what's going on with time. So that's one theory. The second theory is that this is more just an attentional process, that it's about your attention systems, and that particularly if something's intrinsically rewarding, that may lock on the attention systems, and it's a locking on of attention rather than an active suppression of the external world that makes you oblivious to that. And again, these are not mutually exclusive. And the third sort of general theory, and again, is that the flow state is actually what's going on when there's perfect synchrony between reward systems and attentional systems, so that those are perfectly matched and attuned, and you're firing on all cylinders with both. So there's been a fair amount of research into flow states, but very little that's been done on terms of looking at what's going on in the brain. I mean, clearly, a championship diver can't be put in an functional MRI machine when they're doing their dives. Athletes aren't the machinery we have right now for measuring what's going on in the brain is fairly bulky, fairly intrusive, fairly distracting. And even an artist who may be less physically, vigorously engaged probably can't do most of their work sitting in a fMRI tube or wired up to an EEG machine. So the studies we have are extremely few and limited, and I would say don't provide, again, they're extremely few. So, I mean, there have been studies summaries saying, oh, the frontal lobe's doing all sorts of things, lighting up during flow states. I'd say the other difficulty is when you're putting an fMRI machine or some bulky machine, we don't have lots of ways to induce the flow state. And most often it's putting someone into a video game setting and hoping that they are performing at that game in a flow state, which has lots of potential problems and issues with it. So my take is we have so little information of what's really going on in the brain, we can't say more, and I won't say more about that. Few other things, and this is again mostly drawing from Csikszentmihalyi's research on certain traits that people have that make them more predestined or to slipping into a flow state. So he says curiosity is one, and curiosity is certainly one that matches or overlaps with what we see in ADD populations on a clinical level, and there's a tiny bit of testing suggesting curiosity is strongly represented in people with ADHD. People who are intrinsically motivated, so the people who are doing what they want to do rather than what society is telling them, or being paid a lot of money, or doing what mom or dad or the teacher want. So intrinsic motivation is a trait that's strongly linked with ADHD. And again, that doesn't mean there aren't people with ADHD who can't be people pleasers or have strong external motivation as well. But having a strong sense of intrinsic motivation and working with that and listening to that and following it is linked with propensity for getting into flow states. The other two traits that Csikszentmihalyi identifies are persistence. So persistence is one that isn't particularly linked strongly with ADHD, except in two different situations. And one is the very state of hyperfocus, and the other is in perseveration, which I would say can be different than hyperfocus, so that continually harping on the same thing. So when, for the first 2 years of his presidency, Donald Trump kept talking about Hillary Clinton, who was never president and was not taking a prominent place on the public scene, and he would go over and over and over and bring it up in situations where no one else had brought it up or no one else thought she was relevant to the conversation. So there can be a form of persistence, which is perseverance, that has a correlation or streak with ADHD. And this brings up the bigger point that I didn't make earlier. The misconception is that ADHD is a deficit of attention. It's clearly not about a deficit of attention. If we want to call it a deficit in the attention realm, it's a deficit over control of attention. And that means it's harder to ignore distractions, it's harder to get absorbed or focused in an activity, but once in an activity, it may be harder to switch out of that activity. So the fourth trait that's Csikszentmihalyi also identified is low egotism, so being less full of yourself. That, to my knowledge, is not particularly correlated with ADHD. I've seen very egotistical people with ADHD and some who have low egotism, so I won't say more there. So studies have shown, though, that people with ADHD do seem to be more prone to have hyperfocus or flow state experiences. To highlight, there are some downsides to the hyperfocus flow state. One is that, again, particularly in ADD, you may be hyper-focusing on something that's not valuable or important in your career, work, relationship, or other to focus on, Two, there can be addiction to this state, and that's been studied in gamers, it's been studied in surfers who are so enamored or attracted to being in the flow and the waves, catching the great wave, that surfing becomes an addictive process in their life, an addictive meaning truly destructive, where they sacrifice jobs, relationships, others in pursuit of that flow state. So other tricks or pointers for people who want to get into the flow state. One is, again, given that it's tied with intrinsic motivation, finding tasks that are intrinsically motivating, or trying to reframe or think about why someone else's assigned task really does align with something you value, something you want, something that's a goal for you. So again, we often oppose extrinsic or intrinsic motivation, but I think more often the trick is, how do we tap in inside of ourselves to the part of ourselves that may really want to achieve that? So finding the internal motivation, intrinsic motivation may be part of there. Two is removing distractions. If you're in a cluttered, busy workspace, it may be harder to get into a flow state, particularly for someone with ADHD, because there's just too many things pulling you away. Three, and this is something often harder for people with ADHD, you are more likely, again, getting that tasks that are highly challenging and that your abilities are highly honed to match that is a prerequisite usually for getting into the flow state. So actually over-practicing, having the basics down solidly is a good foundation, and some of Csikszentmihalyi's own work on Montessori schools, where certain basic skills are practiced and creativity is allowed and enhanced, and people are allowed to follow their intrinsic motivations. But again, the basics are practiced. It's not that kids are just randomly doing the hell of whatever they want. So that there's studies he conducted with his colleagues showing that does seem to set people up for being more easily and more prone to going into the flow state. And the other point I'd say is that often people, so strengthening metacognitive skills, so learning, practicing, how do you set goals? How do you monitor yourself? How do you check in when you're doing, how do you reflect on yourself, are all skills that can be practiced and enhanced, and are ones that often in ADHD need strengthening or enhancing, but those can be practiced and trained. And for ADHD people, I'd say a fifth sort of important step is knowing how to stop or get out of ADHD hyperfocus states, and 2 points there. One is being careful of when you're getting into it, and particularly with circadian rhythms and day-night, don't start an engrossing video game half hour before you're going to go to bed. That's setting you up for getting into a hyperfocus state where you blow past bedtimes and everything else you may be trying to do in your life to take good care of yourself. So one is sort of pausing before you start an activity, particularly at certain times of day, that may have the propensity to pull you into a hyper-focused state. And then in terms of getting you out when you may have gone too deeply down the rabbit hole, is the general strategy is either setting alarms and or using people around you, your social network, as your alarms to check in. If I don't show up for lunch, give me a call to make sure I'm not just still hyper-focusing on emails instead of getting through to my work project. So that's all I have to say about flow, and I hope it flowed for you. I will be back next week to talk about CBT for ADHD. That's all, and stay healthy and happy. I'm not seeing any questions so far, so I will end right here. Bye.